Thomas the Tank Engine today truly is a really useful engine. He travels up and down his branch line, pulling Annie and Clarabelle and dozens of passengers up and down the line on the island of Sodor. But Thomas's joy, his happiness, it masks his pain, because Thomas fought in the Second World War. And today we're going to discuss what he got up to in that conflict and how he really is a useful engine that is absolutely racked by the guilt of losing his brother. Welcome back to 5 Minute History, the weekly series where patrons choose the topic. Today we'll be discussing Thomas the Tank Engine's efforts during the Second World War, courtesy of look at the date this was published. Let's get into it. Thomas the Tank Engine hails from the island of Sodor. Well, not originally. Originally he comes from Brighton, but he lives on the island of Sodor. And when the Germans invaded Poland, Thomas and his brother Timothy enlisted in the British Army. Together they travelled across the Channel as part of the British Expeditionary Forces. When the Germans broke through the Ardennes, however, the BEF had to make their way back to the sea. Timothy unfortunately was forced to remain behind here, there only being one space on the boat. Thomas and Timothy last saw each other as the boat pulled away from Dunkirk, and Timothy was later killed by a Stuka dive bomber, and Thomas would swear eternal revenge on the Nazis for this action. Back in Britain, Thomas was suffering from severe PTSD at losing his brother, and he joined the Home Guard after being forced out of the army and onto a leave of absence. During this period in the Home Guard, he was repainted into wartime black, but for some reason they decided to keep the yellow one. Perhaps the Photoshop broke. Armed with a blunderbuss and a Vickers gun, what history teachers haven't taught you is, in that 1940, during the Battle of Britain, German forces landed on the island of Sodor using Schnellboots. Thomas and the local Home Guard responded, and as the Germans came ashore from their Schnellboots into Brentham Docks, Thomas drove down to the docks while carrying Annie and Clarabelle and a local brass band who played a loud rendition of Land of Hope and Glory, while he provided drive-bys on the German position with the gun from his cabin. Proving himself to truly be a useful engine again, Thomas was given his chance, and he came ashore with Allied forces on D-Day, landing at Sword with the British 3rd Division. Thomas came ashore with a special D-Day tracks added to his wheels, and he made his way ashore where he found himself on the tracks. Joining the French rail network, Thomas would later take the fight to the Germans here, cutting their reinforcements off and destroying 3 Panzer IVs himself, while preventing the Panzers from assaulting the beaches. And it wasn't actually a Spitfire that took out Rommel, no. Thomas drove by him, LA style. After his successes in France, Thomas was given some R&R, and he was seconded to American forces where he assisted in seizing the bridge at Remagen. However, the collapse of the bridge left Thomas isolated and alone on the front, inside the German lines. He couldn't get his way back across the river to get back to American lines. At first he was taken prisoner here, but this was not to last. Gathering steam after stealing some coal, he managed to break away from his captors, but he was pursued by a squad of Gestapo locomotives until he was able to reach Soviet lines, when they were beaten back. Thomas would remain in the USSR for a time here, and unfortunately he would be taken to Moscow at this point to be questioned by Beria, who was really not a useful engine, until the Soviets finally realised who he actually was. Once he was able to prove his identity after contacting the British government, Thomas was given permission, as he was unable to travel back to the United Kingdom, to carry on fighting the war and to assist the Red Army as it assaulted Berlin. He was also given the orders to try and capture special German technology. But unfortunately, he got a bit preoccupied due to his swearing of his vows of eternal damnation against the German army. Thomas himself would carry the 3rd Shock Army into Berlin, alongside Comrade Gordanovich, an IS steam engine, and Comrade Henry Skov, an SD-class locomotive. Together, the 3 engines were truly useful comrades, and they assisted in seizing the capital with the 3rd Shock Army. Thomas would actually take it a bit further, taking the fight directly to the Reichstag himself, and being the true person who raised the Red Banner. However, this scene was later shot again for propaganda purposes due to the fact that Thomas was British and the Soviets wanted to present Soviet citizens raising the banner. Thomas again was now a really useful engine, and he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union to go alongside with his other bravery medals due to his actions throughout the war. Thomas would later make his way back home after the war, stealing a Soviet destroyer to do so, but then obviously giving it back at the end, but, trying to steal some information off it. But not before as well, he also stole the plans to the Soviet gauge system and network for MI6. After the war, Thomas would retire to Sodor, living the rest of his life in peace. And to this day, he chooses to not talk about the war. So when you do go on his branch line next, just don't ask him about what he was doing between 1939 and 1945. like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.